All right. Well, welcome to our fourth demo day and the last of 2020. We're delighted to have Anderson Frailey here with us today. Anderson is a second-year PhD student at the University of Virginia. He's also a core maintainer of the tax brain and tax data models in the PSL library. And he's here today to show us how to use the web application for tax brain. So Anderson, take it away.
Great. Thanks for that introduction, Jason. So like Jason said, I'm just going to quickly go through how to use the TaxBrain web application. So I'll go ahead and share my screen, and then we can walk through Compute Studio and the app there. So Compute Studio, as many of y'all might know, is just a nice web application for sharing computational models, especially the tax variety. So if we sign in here, we can go from there to the TaxBrain page. So to get to the TaxBrain page itself, you just need to come to this models drop down and pick on PSL models / TaxBrain. And then go to the app. So there are three main sections of the app that I'll talk about before we go ahead and let things run. So up at the top here is a nice little input box for basically your notes on the simulation you're about to run. So if you wanted, you could rename it. So we'll call this TaxBrain demo. And also you could add some notes as well, just about the app. You want to say, describe the reform you're trying to create in this space. And you can write it all just in standard markdown. So you can include bulleted lists, numbered lists, bold, italic, underlined links, whatever you want to sort of add some context around the reform that you're trying to run. And then if we scroll down a bit, we can get to the sort of the meat of the application itself. And there are three main sections here. So the first is the section on the left here that has the start year, data source, and useful sample. These are basically just sort of like meta parameters to inform your simulation. So with the start year, intuitively, it's just the first year of the simulation that you're going to be running. So we have every year from 2013 to 2030 that you can choose. And then it'll run, the number of years that it'll run for will depend on your selection for useful sample. So if you set useful sample to true, it's going to run the simulations for the entire budget window. So a 10-year simulation from the start year to whatever that last year that we have available is. And it's going to use all of the data available to run the calculations. If, on the other hand, you set full sample to false, all it's going to do is run your simulation for 1 year and only use a subset of the data itself. And this is just to make things run a little bit quicker. So if you don't need a full projection of how your policy is going to work, you just want a nice quick sort of taste for what it's going to do, then you can just set full sample to false and run everything a lot quicker. But we'll put it back to true just for the sake of this example. And then finally, the last section here is the data source section. So you can select the PUF or the CPS, and the difference between these two is pretty interesting. So the PUF itself is derived from the IRS public use file. So this is just a publicly available data set of representative tax units that is weighted to represent the entire country. And then we also statistically match that data from the IRS with data from the current population survey, just to add a demographic aspect to the data itself and a little more information there. So the PUF that we're using is from 2011. There's usually a pretty substantial offset between the current year and what year the PUF is available. So right now, I think the most recently available PUF is from 2012. So we're not far behind, even though it is 2011. And then we statistically match that with the 2016 CPS as well. If, on the other hand, you chose the CPS option, the CPS is a combination of three of the March current population survey supplemental files. So we use the 2013, 14, and 15 CPS files and then aggregate them all into one big data set. And what's nice about the CPS is that we can also include information on benefit program participation. such as Medicare and Medicaid, SSI, and TANF, as well as your more standard income data variables information like wages, salaries, so on and so forth. So it's not quite as detailed as the PUF is in terms of these income sources, but it provides some information elsewhere, which we can use to run our simulations. But for now, we'll use the public use file for the simulation. And what's great about TaxBrain is actually it's one of the very few options you have for accessing this public use file without paying for it yourself. So normally to use the public use file from the IRS, you have to pay something around like $8,000 to $10,000 and basically sign your life away to promise you won't give any of the information away. But with TaxBrain, you have this online interface to use the data set that maintains all the privacy protections that are necessary for everyone included in the data, but lets anyone actually run this file itself. So that's just another nice feature of this TaxBrain web application. And if at any point you need me to clarify or ask a question, feel free to just interrupt me rather than just waiting to the end. But if not, I'll just continue on. So on to the next two sections. So this is where we actually get to start implementing our policy reforms. And there are two main parts to this. So first, on the left-hand side, you have this sort of table of contents of the different areas of policy you can update. So you see like payroll taxes, standard and itemized deductions, personal income, universal basic income, and benefits. So we have a pretty wide range of policy options you can play with. And if you clicked on any of these sections, then you would go straight down to that section on the right-hand side where you have the actual policy parameters you can update. So let's go ahead and start taking a look there, because this is where you're going to actually be inputting your reform. So as you can see here, if we look at this payroll taxes section, we have the text boxes that are auto-populated with the current law policy for all of these values. So what we've essentially done on the back end is taken the current individual income tax code, coded it up, and auto-populated each of these text boxes with whatever current law is. So if you don't want to update the entire tax code, that's fine. You can just input what you want, and then we'll use current law for everything. For example, this first box with the Social Security payroll tax rate, it's auto-populated with 12.4%. But if you wanted to update that to say 15%, all you need to do is click on the box and type in 0.15. And that's it. Now that reform's implemented, and we can go from there. And what's great about this TaxBrain web app as well is it actually will tell you if whatever you've implemented doesn't work. So for example, if you look at the Medicare payroll to 150%, then TaxBrain would throw an error and say, no, you can't do that. You need to set it equal or less than to 1. So you know before you even run the model whether or not the parameters that you're entering will actually work or are valid, I should say. So let's get rid of that and just go back to the default value. And this will work as well with the actual numbers, not just the tax rates. But we can scroll down a bit and pick a few more policy parameters to update before we go ahead and just run the model. So here in this above the line deduction section, this is where you could actually repeal some of these deductions. So if for example, you wanted to get rid of the student loan interest deduction, you could just set this to 1. And now that deduction has 100% of that deduction has been repealed. If you tried to set it for something less than 1, like 0.5, then now only half of that deduction is repealed. So you have a lot of options here for how you want to set up your tax reform. We've done a pretty good job of making it as flexible as possible thus far. So keep scrolling down, you'll see credits, different exemption amounts. So for example, I wanted to bring back the personal exemption, even though it had been previously repealed by the TCJA. I can go ahead and say, all right, well, let's give everybody an additional $2,000 deduction. Just by entering 2,000, you can see it's indexed to inflation. If you wanted to, you could just unclick that CPI button, and now it's no longer indexed. And also, all of these parameters will have this little info box you can hover over, and it'll tell you what the parameter actually does. So you see for personal independent exemption, it says subtracted from AGI in calculation of taxable income for taxpayer and dependent. So now you know that whatever this amount is going to be subtracted from the AGI. So if you're not totally sure what a parameter means, just float over the info box and we'll let you know exactly what's going on. We continue scrolling down. Let's say we wanted to reduce the standard deduction to sort of offset what we just did with the personal exemption, how we added it back. Well, now we can drop the standard deduction for a single filer from $12,000 to $10,000, for example. And if we wanted to drop it for a joint filer, we could do that back to $20,000, and it's back to $10,000. Head of household, we can drop that to $16,000, and widow to $20,000. And I'm just plugging in numbers here. This is not an endorsement of any specific policy, but just for demonstration purposes. But as we keep scrolling, you can see we have even the earned income tax credit broken down by the number of kids in your household, phase-in rates. It's a pretty robust model of the individual income tax side. So let's maybe make one or two more changes before we go ahead and run the model, and we can talk about some of the outputs that are going to be created. So we'll click over here. So if we want to go to personal income, it'll jump us straight down to that section. So let's say we wanted to reduce the personal income rate for from 12% for this group to just 10%. Just enter in 0.1. If you wanted to then go up to the top bracket and increase that rate to 0.4, it's all very easy to do. And we also have this nice universal basic income section as well, where now if you wanted to model a UBI, you can do that. It'll just say, all right, everyone in the household, and we have this in our data, the number of people in the household that are under 18, 18 to 20, and 21 and over. So you can specify, well, I want everyone who is above 18 to get, say, $12,000 in UBI every year. It's an easy. And now you've implemented some UBI reforms and can test those. And then finally, the last section I want to go over is this benefits section. So this only really works with the CPS file because that's the only file that we have this benefit information for. But if you wanted to test a policy reform, or say you replaced all these benefit programs with a UBI, you can do that just by first entering the UBI amount up here, and then you can repeal or not repeal each of these different kinds of benefits. And you get just a simple drop down for true or false with whether or not you want to repeal them. So it's not as flexible as you had with the deductions where you can say repeal part of the benefits. It's sort of all or nothing here, but it still gives you the ability to test out these different reforms. And then this last section is if you wanted to make your simulations dynamic by adding in some kind of elasticity assumptions as well with them. We're not going to do that here just because that adds a lot of time to the runtime for actually running the model. But if you wanted to say update the elasticity of taxable income, you can do that. It's all available to you here. But again, that'll add a lot of time to the model run. So let's go ahead and just take the form we have now. We can just click run, and you'll get this little pop-up with some options. So by default, all of these simulations are public, so anyone can view them. But if you wanted to make it private, you could. I'll leave this public so that anyone can go back and look at it later if you'd like. And also, if you don't want to wait around while the model runs, you can just have Compute Studio email you as soon as it's over. But we won't need to do that because we're watching it. So let's go ahead and hit run. It'll validate the inputs. And then once those are validated, it'll start running the model. And what's happening here now is we have this Python app that's sitting on a server, and Compute Studio basically just took all those inputs we had, bundled them up into the right format for the Python app, and just passed it up to the server. And now it's actually crunching the numbers. So in each of those data sets, the PUF and the CPS, what they essentially are composed of are individual tax units. So every row in the data set is a tax unit, and that's going to have information on the marital status, their income, capital gains, the number of dependents, so on and so forth. Basically everything you might find on your standard individual income tax form. And TaxBrain is sort of a wrapper for the tax calculator microsimulation model, which has been lovingly described as TurboTax on steroids, because what it's essentially doing is taking all that information from our data and taking all the new tax input parameters that we created and just calculating everyone's taxes in that data set. So the PUF has about 280,000 tax units, each weighted to be representative of the entire country. So it's calculating the taxes of each of those 280,000 tax units. And then at the end, it'll aggregate all those individual taxes up, weighted accordingly, and produce a few tables and graphs that we can use as well. And a new feature that we recently added is this nice little report. So it creates a little PDF report that's kind of similar to what you might see from JCT or the Tax Policy Center, which is a quick little summary of the tax reform. And that's still a work in progress, but it is interesting to see. So we'll go over that when this model finishes. But in the meantime, are there any questions so far about what's going on or how it works?
I have a question for you, Anderson. This is Rick Evans. Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you.
So am I right that the options in TaxBrain are really a subset of the options that are available in the full tax calculator model that this is using?
So it covers up pretty much everything, almost everything. So we don't have, you can, in the actual tax calculator model, you can include a few more assumptions on, say, economic growth. So if you want to say that GDP is growing at a certain rate, you can include those in tax calculator. We haven't added those to TaxBrain yet, but we're working on it. That's sort of the next step. But in terms of the policy parameters, just about any policy parameter that you can get in the tax calculator model itself will be available on TaxBrain as well.
And then if somebody has some new idea of a tax policy they want to try that's not part of TaxBrain and tax calculator, they really have to just download the API and do some customization themselves. Is that right?
Yes. As now, there's no way to sort of make your own policy parameter in TaxBrain, so you would need to update tax calculator itself for that. But we figure that if you are the type who wants to do something like that and add some of these advanced options, you're probably technically familiar enough with programming and tax models themselves that you should be able to handle that. It'd be hard to make a sort of like GUI interface for just your average tax curious person to come in and create that in TaxBrain itself. I think we're almost done running here, just about. Yes, so TaxBrain, the Python API, is sort of a wrapper on the tax calculator model that I've mentioned before, and then this behavioral responses model. And that's how you can get in some of those behavioral forms that I mentioned. But now that we have the results here, we can just go through them and see what we get from TaxBrain itself. So first, you get this very simple graph that just shows you your income tax, payroll tax, and combined tax liability for both the reform and your baseline. So your baseline is just your current law policy here. Nothing fancy. As of now, you can't implement like one policy, use that as a new baseline, and then create another reform on top of that. That'd be a cool feature, but it would add a lot of complexity to the web app, so we haven't done that. But you can customize this chart a little bit. So if you wanted to remove the line showing the baseline, you can just click on base, and now all you have left is the reforms aggregate tax liability by year, and then you can bring the base back. Or if you just want the base, you can do that as well. And this is just a bouquet chart. So it's a nice interactive online web app. You can hover over it and see the exact amount. So you can see that in 2026, the baseline combined tax liabilities is a little over $3.5 trillion. Then you can go up to the reform, and now under our reform, we've bumped that up to about $4.2 trillion. So it's interactive as well. And if you wanted to, you can click on this little floppy disk icon and save it as well. And if we look at our other outputs, so you have this table. So this will show just total tax liability by year. And you can choose to look at current law, the reform, or the change. So you have a lot of interactivity there in terms of what we're looking, in terms of what outputs that you want. And in a second, I'll show you how you can actually save these as well to use in, say, a report you're putting together, or to maybe share on Twitter or whatever other social media platform you would like. And then our last output from TaxBrain is a bigger table that shows a little more detail. So it takes a second to load because there are actually a ton of tables in this one table. But here you can see a distributional table that will show you the effects or the distributional analysis of tax policies for each of the years that we've calculated. And then you can choose to do it under the current law or reform. And you can look at either income bins, so like $0 to $10,000 in expanded income, or income deciles, if you wanted to look at the, say, bottom 10% versus the top 1%. And this table will show you the number of people in each of these deciles, total AGI in the deciles, the number of itemizers, standardized filers, etc., and their income tax. So this is under the reform. So if we wanted to look, we can come to this column and see, all right, well, what is the, for example, we'll go with the taxable income in each decile. So we can see in the 10 to 20%, we have about $148 billion in taxable income. So all of these monetary totals are in billions, and all of the non-monetary totals, such as AGIs, in millions. But we can do that, and then we can scroll down to the bottom and see in the top 1%, we have almost $2 trillion in taxable income. So it gives you a much more detailed look at the results. You can also look at the change in the results by looking at the differences tables, and you can see the percentage change in after-tax income on average, UBI benefits, the average tax change in each of these income bins based on the in each of the income bins. So it's just a lot more detailed information. And then finally, for these outputs in the last few minutes, I'll show you how you can actually download all of this to use it however you wish. So again, it's a little bit slow because there's just a lot there. If you go to download results, just click save, you'll get a zip file. And in this zip file, it has all of those tables that we just presented as CSVs. And then on top of that, there's one PDF in here that is like a report. So it puts together a simple, very, very basic, simple policy report for your model. And then you can go ahead and rename it as you want. Nice little summary. So it'll have a small summary of the reform that you made. It'll show you some of the notable changes that have been made, the aggregate changes, then some distributional analysis, and it'll let you know what parameters were changed. So it all uses a pretty basic template that is then filled in based on what you selected. So here it tells us, all right, this report summarizes the fiscal impact of modifying a number of areas of the tax code, including the payroll taxes, standard deduction, and above the line deduction sections. The baseline for this analysis is current law as of December 14th, 2020. So then it gives you a quick summary. So it says, over this budget window, you expect it to increase aggregate tax liability by about $7 trillion. And those with income between $100,000 and $200,000 get the biggest change. And on average, they'll see their tax liabilities increase by about $4,500. Then it lists some notable changes throughout the entirety of that budget window. So you can see that the number of standard deduction filers increases by 15% in 2026. And then in 2021 or 2020, you see after-tax income increases by 21%. So it goes in and searches for, in each of these years, for some big notable changes that you might have, and then summarizes them in this report for you here. And then it produced a few tables. So it shows you the total tax liability change for every year. Working on some of the margin formatting, it's a little wonky there. But you get the tables, and then you'll get these nice figures. So you'll see the aggregate change in tax liability by each year again. The distributional tables that we went over on TaxBrain are also in here. And then you get a nice summary of your policy changes. So you can see we changed the standard deduction amount for the single filers. We changed the personal exemption amount. We changed the UBI benefits, and we changed the Social Security tax rate. And it gives you a nice table summarizing these. One baseline tells you the baseline is just current law. We have no behavioral assumptions, but if you did have some assumptions, they would appear here, as well as those consumption and growth assumptions that I had mentioned earlier. When we add the ability to include those in tax calculator, they'll be summarized here. And then finally, it gives you a list of the models that were used. And one last table. So the formatting is a little weird. You can see it sort of through this table in with the model versions, but that'll be something that we fixed in the next few weeks. Then it gives you this, but it does give you this nice graph that shows you the percentage change in after-tax income by income bin. So this light green is an increase in after-tax income, and as you get into blue, it becomes a decrease in after-tax income. So as I mentioned, the formatting is still still a work in progress, but it is a nice, simple report that if you wanted to, if you were, say, a policymaker who needed to just get a quick summary of something up to your boss, you can go in, plug in your tax code, and then hand them this PDF report instead of trying to link them to the web app if they're not quite going to understand what's going on there. So it's a nice, simple way to email your results around. But a nice part of the web app is that you can actually share what you're working on by either adding usernames to who are also Compute Studio members, or just sending them a link to your results. That link will be permanent and always refer back to what you've made. So it looks like we're just about out of time here. So I'm happy to take any questions at the end or go over anything that we've gone over so far. If there's any confusion, I can clear up.
Anderson, this is Jason. I have a question about, so suppose I did a run like you did here and I wanted to modify part of that. How would I go back and create a new run, but based on a parameterization I entered before?
Yeah, so you can do that just clicking this fork option. So it's going to create a copy of the run you just had. And then you go back over to the input section, and you can see it has the policy parameter inputs that we've already made. And now you can update whatever else you want to throw in there. So if, say, you now wanted to add a, if you wanted to update the personal exemption phase out rate, you could say bump that to 0.3%. And now all the models and updates you had before, it's still there. And then you can run them on top of the new parameters you've updated.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right, Anderson, thanks a lot for your demo today. We really enjoyed it, and everyone will be back in 2021 with some new demos of PSL models.